The land had gone brittle beneath the last breaths of autumn, every stalk of grass whispering against the dry wind that came crawling down from the Sangre de Cristo range. Evening light lay low and copper on the mesas, stretching long shadows across Eli Harper's ranch. His fences groaned like old bones in the cold, and the windmill turned slow, creaking against the weight of another winter coming on. Eli had grown used to that sound, creak, sigh, settle. It was the sound of endurance, of things that refused to fall apart though they should have long ago. He was a man past 40, with the shoulders of someone who had lived twice that long. His wife had been gone 5 years, taken by fever and buried beneath a cottonwood near the dry creek bed. Since then, the world had folded itself into silence. He moved through the evenings like a ghost, feeding the horses, checking the corral, splitting wood until the ache in his arms dulled the ache behind his ribs. He boiled his coffee in a blackened tin pot, sat on the porch as the sky burned itself down to ash, and listened to the plains breathing. That was his peace, if peace could be called a kind of emptiness that no longer hurt. That night, the air changed. A storm brewed out west, dragging dark thunderheads over the horizon. The wind shifted cold and sharp, smelling of iron and rain. Eli was walking the fence line, lantern in hand, when his horse snorted and shied. He lifted the light. At first he thought it was a coyote, huddled low against the wire. Then the lantern glow touched a face, small, gaunt, eyes black as wet stone. A little girl, no more than 8, wrapped in a torn blanket, her lips cracked from wind and thirst. Eli's breath caught. He knelt, spoke gently, though his voice came out rough. "Easy there, little one. You hurt?" She didn't answer, only stared at the bread crust he pulled from his coat pocket. He offered it out, slow. When she took it, her hands trembled so bad the crumbs fell to the dirt. She ate them anyway. He lifted her carefully, felt how light she was, and carried her back to the cabin. The sky broke open as he reached the porch, rain spilling down in thick slanted sheets. Inside, the fire had nearly gone out. He threw on fresh wood, stoked the coals, and wrapped her in a quilt. She didn't speak, only stared into the flames, her eyes following the flicker like something half-remembered. When she fell asleep, he sat across from her and watched the rain run down the window glass. He told himself he'd take her into town come morning, hand her to the sheriff or the mission folk who took in strays. But as the night deepened, he kept glancing toward her, the way her tiny hand clutched the edge of the quilt, as if afraid even dreams might take it from her. By dawn, the storm had moved on, leaving the world washed and cold. The girl was still asleep when Eli stepped outside. The ground steamed faintly under the rising sun, the air clean as new tin. He was cutting kindling when he felt it, the sudden stillness that comes before a presence. She stood by the barn, tall and motionless, her braids streaked with rain. Her clothes were travel-worn, her face carved in lines of strength and sorrow. An Apache woman. Eli set down his axe slowly. She didn't move, didn't reach for the bow slung across her back. Her gaze was fixed on the cabin window. "She's inside," Eli said, his voice cautious. "Found her by the fence line last night, half-starved." The woman's dark eyes turned on him then, sharp, assessing, as if measuring his soul against something older than law. She walked past him without a word and entered the cabin. Eli followed. The little girl woke and whispered a name, Nalinah. The woman knelt beside her, touching her forehead, her face softening for the first time. When she looked back at Eli, her expression had changed from fear to something solemn and unyielding. "You fed my daughter," she said quietly, her voice low but steady. "Now, by ancestral law, I belong to you." Eli blinked. "What?" "In the ways of my people," she continued, "to feed a child who is not yours binds a life debt between spirits. I cannot take her and walk away. It would dishonor both you and me. My place is now in your home, until that debt is balanced." Eli felt a flush rise in his neck. "Ma'am, I didn't do it for any law. Just didn't see right leaving a child to die in the cold. You don't owe me a damn thing." But she only stood there, unmoving, her gaze unwavering. "It is not a thing owed. It is a thing carried. You cannot refuse what was made sacred by the act." The words hung in the air like smoke. The girl sat silently between them, clutching her mother's shawl. Eli felt the weight of their eyes, the mother's steady, the child's wide and uncertain. He rubbed his jaw, exhaled through his nose. "One night," he said finally. "You can stay one night till you're rested. There's food enough. After that, you go where you need to." Nalinah inclined her head slightly, neither thankful nor angry, merely accepting. "One night," she said. That night stretched long. The cabin felt smaller with them inside, the air thick with quiet breaths, the rustle of fabric, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Eli couldn't look at her without noticing the scars on her wrists, old rope burns faded to white. Nor could he miss how her daughter pressed close to her side even in sleep, as if the world might take her again. He lay awake, listening to the soft crackle of the fire, wondering what kind of law bound her to a stranger for a single act of kindness. And though he told himself he wanted the cabin empty again come dawn, part of him feared the silence that would return when they were gone. Outside, the wind turned colder. The prairie whispered through the dark, endless and unfeeling. But inside, for the first time in years, Eli Harper was not alone. Tone and realization, cold, lonely, and cautious. The firelight reflects mistrust and hunger. Two wounded souls, one shaped by loss, the other by exile, find themselves bound by an old law neither fully understands. Beneath the silence, something ancient stirs, the faint, unsettling sense that destiny has already chosen the path ahead. The days after the storm passed in a quiet rhythm neither of them spoke of, but both obeyed. Morning came pale and brittle, sunlight catching on frost along the fence posts. Eli rose before dawn, as always, the scrape of his boots against the floorboards marking the start of another day. But now, when he stepped outside, he could hear other sounds, the rustle of a shawl, the soft tread of Nalinah's feet, the faint hum of her voice as she woke the child. She worked without being asked. The first morning, she was already hauling water from the well before Eli had finished his coffee. The next, she was mending the torn seams on his work gloves. Her hands were quick and sure, her movements carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived much and expected little. Eli didn't know what to make of her. She spoke only when needed, her tone neither humble nor proud, as though words were precious things to be spent carefully. Sometimes he caught her watching him, her eyes dark and unreadable, the kind of gaze that measured a man not by his words, but by the weight of his silences. He told himself her presence hadn't changed the ranch. The horses still needed feeding, the troughs still needed ice broken, and the roof still leaked when it rained. But he found himself listening for her footsteps in the kitchen, noticing the small ways she ordered the space, how she laid herbs to dry by the window, how she swept the dirt floor with rhythmic patience, how she spoke to her daughter in soft, musical syllables that seemed older than the land itself. Taza, the little girl, grew stronger each day. She followed Eli to the barn sometimes, clutching a carved wooden bird that her mother had whittled for her. She didn't speak much, but her laughter, small and sudden, cut through the cold air like a spark. When she smiled, Eli felt something ache deep inside, a part of him long buried under dust and regret. At night, when the wind pressed against the windows, memories crept in uninvited. Eli would lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling, and see again the fever taking his wife, her skin pale and damp, her breath turning shallow, her fingers clutching his sleeve before slipping away. He remembered the stillness afterward, the little grave beneath the cottonwood, and the half-built cradle he'd burned behind the barn because he couldn't stand to see it empty. He had learned to live with ghosts, but their whispers had never felt as close as they did now. For Nalinah, too, the nights were heavy with memory. She often sat by the fire after Taza had fallen asleep, carving small shapes from driftwood or sewing a strip of beadwork that shimmered softly in the lamplight. Her eyes would drift toward the flames, but her mind was far away, back to a canyon where smoke once rose, to the smell of gunpowder and horses, to the cries of her people scattering before rifles. Her husband's name had been Koso. He'd been strong and fearless, quick with laughter, quicker with his bow. One morning soldiers came riding through the pass, men in dusted coats who mistook his pride for defiance. They shot him before the sun reached its height. Nalinah had fled with her daughter in her arms, running from bullets and hatred alike. Since that day, she had not sung the old songs aloud. Now, as she moved through Eli's cabin, she carried that silence like a second skin. The walls held their breath around her. The air between them was filled with what could not be said. One afternoon, Eli came in from the barn to find her outside by the corral, oiling his saddle. The sight stopped him cold, her dark hair glinting in the sunlight, her fingers tracing the worn leather as though mending more than a tool. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied simply. "It needs it." There was no defiance in her tone, only a quiet practicality that left him unsure how to answer. He nodded once and walked away, but her words lingered. "It needs it," as though care was reason enough. That evening they ate together for the first time. The table was rough-hewn, the meal plain, beans, bread, and coffee. Taza sat between them, drowsy with warmth. Eli tried to keep conversation light, but words felt clumsy in his mouth. Nalinah broke the silence first. "You built this house alone?" He nodded. "Started it when I got married. Finished it after." She studied him for a moment, then said softly, "My husband built ours too. In the canyon where the river bends. He said walls mean nothing if the heart inside them is weak." Eli stared into his coffee. He was right about that. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance something passed between them, a quiet recognition, a mutual grief that needed no translation. The days grew shorter. Wind came sweeping down from the mountains, biting and dry. Together they worked through the cold. She chopped kindling while he repaired the chicken coop. She gathered herbs while he hunted rabbits. The rhythm became familiar, a wordless truce that felt almost like belonging. Yet beneath that rhythm, pain hummed like a low ember, steady, unrelenting. Eli wrestled with guilt he could never voice. His people, his kind, had carved their homes into land that wasn't theirs. Men who looked like him had destroyed lives like hers. Every kindness he offered felt like a hollow repayment to ghosts he could never face. For Nalinah, the pain came from within. Her own people had cast her out for surviving where others did not, for taking food from white hands, for raising a child between two worlds. She no longer knew where she belonged, only that this place, this quiet ranch with its broken fences and lonely man, felt less cruel than most. One night, a cold wind swept across the plains, rattling the shutters. Inside, Eli mended a bridle by lamplight while Nalinah sat nearby, sewing patches into Taza's blanket. The fire popped softly. He spoke without looking up. "You said you owe a debt. I never asked for it. You did not have to," she answered. "It exists because you fed her. Then when is it paid?" She paused, the needle glinting in her fingers. "When we no longer owe anything to sorrow." Eli looked at her then, really looked. The firelight caught her face in gold and shadow, her expression unreadable yet full of quiet strength. He didn't understand her words, but they settled deep in him all the same. Outside, the plains lay silent beneath the stars. The wind moved over them like breath over an old wound, stirring the grass in slow, endless waves. Inside the cabin, two weary souls worked beneath the same roof, their lives bound not by choice but by the faint, persistent hope that mercy might still be possible. Tone and realization, somber, reflective, and symbolic. The past stretches long across both hearts, two broken spirits surviving by the grace of shared silence. The realization dawns that survival isn't merely to endure hunger or cold, but to find in one another the smallest flicker of faith that life, even after ruin, can still hold gentleness. The first snow came without warning. Eli had seen the clouds gathering for 2 days, long, low, and bruised purple along the mountains, but he hadn't expected the cold to come down so fast. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and by dusk, snow was falling thick as ash, driving sideways on the wind. The plains vanished under a shroud of white. He'd just managed to bring the horses into the barn when the gale hit in full. The wind roared like the sea, shaking the rafters, driving needles of ice through the cracks. By the time he stumbled back into the cabin, His coat was crusted with frost, and his beard heavy with it. Nalinah met him at the door, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her face lit by firelight. "The storm is angry," she said quietly, glancing at the window. "It will not rest soon." Eli shut the door against the howling dark. Then we waited out, snow piled high against the threshold by midnight. The world outside ceased to exist. Only the wind, the cold, and the soft crackle of the fire remained. Inside, the cabin had turned into a small island of warmth, the walls breathing with the rhythm of the flames. Taza slept wrapped in quilts near the hearth, her small hand resting on her mother's skirt. For the first time since they'd come, there was no work to do. No fences to mend, no wood to haul, only stillness and the sound of the storm trying to claw its way inside. Eli sat by the fire, boots steaming, watching the flames dance over the logs. Nalinah sat across from him, quiet as ever, her eyes half hidden in the glow. Hours passed that way, broken only by the wind's low moan and the occasional snap of burning wood. It was she who spoke first. "You had a wife," she said softly, not as a question but a knowing. He looked up, surprised. "How do you know?" "The way you walk the house," she replied. "You move around the empty space as if you still expect someone to fill it." He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked again. Then he said, "Her name was Clara. She laughed at everything, even the things that weren't funny. Used to hum while she cooked. Drove me half mad with it." A faint smile touched his lips, then faded. "Fever took her. Winter of '82. I buried her myself, under the cottonwood by the creek." Nalinah nodded, her gaze steady. "The earth remembers kindness. She will rest easy." He swallowed, throat rough. "What about you?" For a long time, she didn't answer. Then her voice came low, almost a whisper. "My husband's name was Koso. He had hands that smelled of cedar, and a voice that made the canyon echo when he sang. One morning, white men rode through our camp. They said he reached for his weapon. He was only shielding our daughter." She fell silent again. The firelight shimmered on her cheek, revealing the faint trace of a tear before she turned away. Eli stared into the flames. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Sorry is a small word," she replied, but her tone held no anger, only exhaustion. "The wind does not say sorry when it breaks the trees. It only moves on." Still, her eyes softened when she looked at him again. "But you fed her," she murmured, nodding toward Taza. "That makes you part of her story." "And mine." He wanted to ask more, to understand what law or spirit she meant, but words failed him. Instead, he nodded once, the fire reflecting in his weary eyes. The silence that followed no longer felt sharp. It was heavy, but shared. Days blurred into one another. The storm raged outside, its voice constant and wild. Inside, warmth and time began to weave fragile threads between them. Eli found himself speaking more than he had in years, about the ranch, the war, the cattle drives that stretched for weeks under cruel suns. Nalinah listened without interruption, sometimes asking questions that made him pause and think. At night, when Taza was asleep, Nalinah told her own stories, not of war or pain, but of songs. She spoke of a world where every living thing had its voice, the river, the pine, the flame. "When you feed a stranger's child," she said one night, her tone gentle, "you bind your spirit to theirs. It is the law of the old ones, not chains, threads, invisible but strong." Eli listened, the firelight washing over his lined face. "Seems a hard world," he murmured, "to carry so many debts." She smiled faintly. "Not debts, balance," he nodded slowly. Somehow, the word made sense. The third night, the storm began to weaken, but the cold deepened. The wind's voice grew distant, weary. Just as Eli was beginning to drift toward sleep, a new sound shattered the calm, a heavy pounding on the door. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. Nalinah pulled Taza close, eyes alert but calm. The pounding came again, followed by a slurred shout. "Hey! Anyone in there? For God's sake, let me in!" Eli unbarred the door and was nearly thrown back by the wind. A man stumbled inside, a settler, half-drunk, coat torn, snow-crusted on his beard. He smelled of whiskey and sweat, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Storm caught me out," he gasped, slamming the door shut behind him. Then his gaze fell on Nalinah, and his face twisted. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't know you was keeping an Apache squaw for company, Harper." Eli's grip on the rifle tightened. "Watch your tongue." The man laughed, mean and cold. "Didn't figure you for the type. Guess the winters get long out here, huh?" He took a step closer, the stink of drink thick in the air. "How much does she cost you?" The words struck like a whip. Nalinah rose silently, her daughter's hand still clutched in hers. She didn't speak, but her eyes burned, steady, unflinching. Eli stepped between them, rifle leveled at the man's chest. "Get out," he said, his voice like gravel. "Now hold on." "I said get out." For a moment, the wind outside was the only sound. Then the man's smirk faltered. He looked at Eli, saw something in his eyes that told him this was no bluff, and muttered a curse. Without another word, he yanked the door open and vanished into the white night. Eli slammed it shut and stood breathing hard. Nalinah was watching him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she reached out and touched his sleeve. "You risked your life for me," she said softly. He shook his head. Didn't risk anything that mattered. But she only smiled, a small, knowing smile, and returned to her daughter's side. When Eli finally sat again, the fire had burned low. He added another log, watching sparks drift upward like small souls seeking sky. The storm outside had begun to die. Inside, something else had changed too, a fragile warmth that no wind could erase. Tone and realization, intimate, dangerous, and transformative. The storm outside mirrors the storm within, the old grief, the new defiance. Through firelight and fear, both learn what trust feels like. Not safety, but the choice to stand beside another even when the world demands distance. Spring came late that year, dragging its feet through the mud. The snow melted slow and stubborn, bleeding into the creeks and leaving the ground soft as memory. The air smelled of thawing earth and wild onions, and the hills began to show a faint fuzz of green, cautious but real. Eli fixed the fence posts one by one, hammer echoing against the silence. Nalinah was in the yard, spreading blankets over a line strung between the porch posts, her dark hair loose in the wind. Taza ran circles around the corral, chasing the chickens with shrill laughter that made the horses prick their ears. The world was waking again, but inside the cabin, the air had changed. Since the storm, since the night he'd driven off that drunken settler, a strange quiet had settled between them, not the heavy silence of distrust, but the uncertain hush that follows a confession. Neither has spoken. They moved around each other like ghosts half afraid to touch, both aware of something fragile threading the space between them. Eli caught himself watching her too often. When she leaned over the wash basin, sleeves rolled, or when she brushed her daughter's hair by firelight. The sight stirred a hunger that frightened him, not lust, but longing. The simple ache to belong again, to speak and be seen. Yet every time their eyes met, he looked away first, ashamed of what he felt and of what it might cost her. He tried to keep busy. Work was safer than thought. One afternoon, with the sun high and soft on the plain, he saddled the bay mare and called for Taza. "You want to learn to ride?" he asked, kneeling to her height. Her eyes widened. Nalinah looked up from the yard. "She is too small," she said. "She'll just sit," Eli replied. Nothing more. For a moment, Nalinah hesitated. Then she nodded once, slowly. "If she falls, she won't," he promised. Taza grinned wide, gripping the saddle horn as Eli lifted her up. He led the mare in slow circles around the yard, one steady hand on the reins. The girl giggled, hair flying in the breeze. Nalinah stood by the porch, hands clasped tightly around her shawl, torn between gratitude and fear. When the lesson ended, Taza slid down and ran to her mother, breathless. "He said I did good, Mama." Nalinah smiled faintly, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Then she looked at Eli, long, searching, and said softly, "You make her brave." Eli touched the brim of his hat. She already was. That small moment of peace held for 2 days. Then, one afternoon, a rider came up the road, a man in a fine duster and clean boots, hat tilted just so. Eli recognized him before he even dismounted. Cole Benson, a rancher from downriver. They'd ridden together years ago, back when Eli still worked the cattle drives. "Well, I'll be damned," Benson said, grinning as he stepped up to the porch. "Didn't think I'd find you still holed up in this dust bowl." "Been keeping busy," Eli said evenly. "What brings you out this way?" "Oh, just passing through. Figured I'd say hello. Heard tell you've got some new company." His eyes flicked past Eli to where Nalinah stood by the doorway, Taza clinging to her skirt. The grin faltered, turning into something thinner. "Didn't figure you for the type to keep, well, such unusual company." Eli's jaw tightened. "She and the girl are staying here for a while." "That's all," Benson chuckled, but the sound was sharp.
"Careful, Harper."
"Folks around here like to talk. Ain't good for a man's name, living under the same roof as an Apache and her brat." Nalinah stiffened. Taza pressed closer to her side. Eli's knuckles whitened on the porch rail, but he said nothing. The silence stretched. Benson tipped his hat with a mocking smile and turned to go. "Don't say I didn't warn you, friend. You know how people are." His horse's hooves clattered down the trail, fading into the wind. Inside, the quiet was suffocating. Nalinah moved about the cabin without a word, folding clothes that didn't need folding, stirring a pot that wasn't cooking. Her movements were sharp, deliberate. Eli tried to speak once, then twice, but the words wouldn't come. Shame held his tongue. When evening fell, the air turned heavy with thunder. The first flashes of lightning lit the plains in harsh white, followed by the low roll of distant rumble. Rain came slow at first, tapping the roof like fingers. Nalinah sat by the window, staring into the dark. Eli was at the table, pretending to read an old newspaper. The fire burned low between them. "You said nothing," she said quietly, without turning. He looked up. "What?" "When he insulted me," she said. "You said nothing." Eli set the paper down. "Wouldn't have done any good. Men like him don't change with talk." Her voice rose just a little, not angry, but trembling with hurt. "Then why did you defend me before, when the drunk came to your door? What made today different?" Eli rubbed a hand over his face. "Because he was drunk and dangerous. Benson's just a fool with words. Not worth the trouble." Nalinah turned to him then, eyes glinting with lightning. "Every word cuts, Eli Harper. You think silence is safer, but it wounds just the same." Her words hit him square. He wanted to answer, to explain how much harder it was to fight the whispers of men he'd known his whole life than to face a stranger's gun. But the truth was simpler and worse. He'd been afraid. Afraid of choosing a side and losing the fragile peace he'd built in his solitude. "I didn't mean—" "I know," she said, voice softening. "But meaning doesn't mend what's broken." The storm broke fully then, shaking the walls with its fury. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolling close and deep. The firelight flickered across their faces, throwing long, trembling shadows. For a moment they stood on opposite sides of the room, caught between apology and pride. Then another flash of lightning filled the cabin, bright as daylight, and they both moved to the same window to watch the storm. Outside, the plains bent beneath sheets of silver rain. The air smelled of wet dust and lightning. Eli stood close enough to feel her warmth beside him, their reflections trembling together on the glass. Neither spoke. He wanted to reach for her, just to touch her hand, to tell her that her dignity mattered more than his fear. But the words stayed locked in his chest. When the thunder faded and the night turned still again, Nalinah stepped away first. "The rain will wash the tracks," she said softly. "Tomorrow no one will know he came." Eli nodded, but his throat was tight. He knew she was wrong. The tracks would remain, only buried deeper, under layers of silence neither of them yet knew how to break. Tone and realization, taut, aching, and unresolved. The tone hums like a wire stretched too thin between two hearts. The realization, dignity costs more than comfort, and silence can wound deeper than any insult. Both understand now that peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the choice to face it, together or alone. The first signs came at dusk. Taza had been quiet all day, her laughter replaced by a dull stillness that frightened more than tears ever could. By nightfall, her skin burned hot beneath Nalinah's hand, and her breath came shallow and quick. River fever, Nalinah knew it before Eli did. the sickness that came from drinking bad water or playing too long near the flooded stream. Eli stood helpless by the hearth, watching Nalinah crush herbs into a bowl, her fingers trembling though her face stayed calm. The cabin's air felt thick, heavy with smoke and fear. "She needs mountain root," Nalinah said at last, voice low but steady. "Only grows in the high places where the snow still sleeps." Eli frowned. "That's half a day's ride through bad ground." "I know," she replied, already reaching for her shawl. "I'll be back before dawn." He stepped forward, blocking the door. "You won't make it alone. Not in this weather," her eyes flashed. "She's my daughter." Eli met her gaze, unflinching. "Then let me come with you." For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Pride warred with exhaustion. Then, wordless, she nodded once. They saddled the horses in silence. The moon hung low, veiled behind thin clouds, and a cold wind scoured the plains. The girl's faint moans followed them out into the night. Eli tied a strip of cloth around his neck, one of Nalinah's scarves left drying by the stove, and whispered a promise to the dark. They rode hard. Through sagebrush and dust, the hoofbeats swallowed by the wind. The land stretched wide and merciless, broken only by starlight glinting off wet stone. Nalinah led the way, her figure small and sure against the horizon. Eli followed close, his breath turning to frost. Hours passed. Then, voices. From behind, faint at first, came the shouts of men. Eli turned in the saddle and caught the distant flicker of lanterns. 3, maybe 4 riders. Benson's crew, he muttered. "What the hell do they want out here?" Nalinah's jaw tightened. "They think we're running." "With what?" "Doesn't matter," she said. "They see what they wish to see." They spurred the horses faster. The wind picked up, carrying sleet that stung like needles. The ground turned treacherous, mud and rock and hidden roots. Then halfway up a narrow trail, Nalinah's horse stumbled. She hit the earth hard, a cry lost in the roar of the storm. Eli was off his saddle in an instant. "You hurt?" She tried to rise, then swayed and dropped to her knees. "Keep going," she rasped. "Get the root." "Not without you." He lifted her, light, burning, trembling, and carried her toward a low bluff nearby, where the earth jutted out to form a shallow cave. The snow hissed as it hit the fire he built from dried brush and scraps of cedar. He wrapped her in his coat, hands shaking more from fear than cold. Her face was pale, lips bluish, breath shallow. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and whispered, "Stay with me." For a while, she drifted between waking and sleep, murmuring words in her language, soft musical syllables Eli didn't understand, but felt in his bones. He fed the fire higher, its glow throwing long shadows that danced across the stone walls. When her eyes opened again, hours later, the fever had turned her gaze glassy. "You shouldn't have followed," she whispered. "Couldn't let you go alone. You owe me nothing." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I owe her," he said, nodding toward the memory of Taza, fevered and waiting in the dark cabin miles away. Nalinah looked into the fire. "You think this is duty? It is not." Her voice trembled with fatigue. "When I said I belonged to you, it was not our law I meant. Not truly. I said it because I saw something in you. Something I thought my people and yours had lost. Kindness." Eli stared at the flames. "Kindness doesn't bring back the dead." "No," she said softly. "But it can keep the living from becoming ghosts." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The fire crackled, the storm hissed against the rock. Eli felt something old and knotted in him begin to uncoil, the ache of years lived without warmth. "I lost my wife," he said quietly. Fever took her quick. Never buried her proper, ground too frozen that winter. I built the fire and just sat there till morning. Never felt warm since. Nalinah reached out, her fingers brushing his hand where it rested on his knee. "Now you do," he met her gaze. The firelight flickered between them, a trembling bridge of gold and shadow. He wanted to speak, wanted to name what filled the air, but the words would have broken it. Instead, he fed the flames, wrapped her tighter in the coat, and sat through the night, keeping her safe. By dawn, the storm had passed. The light came thin and silver through the clouds, touching her face with pale warmth. Her fever had eased. She stirred, eyes clearing, and whispered, The root. Eli pointed to a small bundle beside the fire. Found it near the rocks while you slept. She smiled, weak but real. Then we go home. They rode slow, the horses weary but steady. The world smelled of wet pine and melting snow. When they reached the cabin, Taza lay pale but breathing steady. Nalinah brewed the herbs and fed her the bitter tea drop by drop. Hours later, the fever broke. Eli stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the plains. Nalinah joined him quietly, her hand brushing his sleeve as she passed. "She will live," she said. He nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "So will we." They didn't speak of what had happened in the hills, or of the warmth that lingered between them like smoke long after the fire had died. There were no promises, no confessions, just the unspoken truth that love, in its purest form, needed no name. That night, when Eli stepped outside, he saw the sky clear and endless. The stars scattered like ashes across black velvet. Behind him, through the cabin's window, firelight glowed, a small, stubborn flame in the wilderness. He smiled faintly, tipping his hat to the wind. Some debts weren't burdens. Some bonds didn't need law to make them real. Tone and realization, passionate yet restrained, alive with quiet courage. The fire stands for both life and forbidden tenderness, proof that warmth can be shared without being claimed. The realization, love isn't about possession or promise, but endurance, the simple act of staying through the storm. Weeks passed, and the land softened under the hand of spring. The hills grew green again, dotted with wild lupine and blue flax. The river, swollen from snowmelt, cut silver through the valley. Life returned in cautious breaths. The creak of the windmill, the murmur of doves nesting in the eaves, the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the yard. Taza had fully mended, her color back, her steps quick as a colt's. She followed Eli from barn to pasture, eager to help with chores. Nalinah worked beside them, quieter than before. Yet something in her movements had changed, less guarded, more certain, as though the land itself had accepted her presence. But peace on the frontier was fragile. Word spread, as it always did. Whispers of the widower living with an Apache woman grew into talk of scandal, then into threats. And when the talk reached Cole Benson's ears, it turned to action. It was a bright morning when the trouble came. Eli had been fixing the corral gate when the sound of horses carried over the ridge. 4 riders, silhouettes against the sky. He knew the shape of the lead man's hat before he saw the face. Benson. They rode down slow, dust curling at their boots. Eli straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, his rifle leaning nearby against the fence. "Morning, Harper," Benson called, false warmth in his voice. "Heard tell you've been keeping unusual company still. Figured it was time we set things straight." Eli said nothing. Benson's grin thinned. "This is white man's land. You know that. Ain't right for her to be here, taking charity, eating from your table." Behind him, one of his men spat into the dirt. "Ought to send her back where she came from." Eli's hand closed around the rifle. "You rode all this way to tell me how to run my house?" Benson shrugged, just giving neighborly advice. Folks don't take kindly to savages setting up home among them. "You keep her here, you'll lose more than your good name." Eli stepped closer, the rifle low but ready. "You leave now, or what?" Before the standoff could tip, a voice cut through the morning, low, steady, and clear as running water. "Enough." Nalinah stood on the porch, her shawl caught in the breeze, her face calm but resolute. Taza clung to her skirts, wide-eyed. The men turned to stare. "You think this land belongs to you," she said, her tone neither defiant nor afraid. But it was not the first fence, nor the first gun, that claimed it. "My people walked it long before you came. We bled in its dust, buried our dead in its hills. And still, the earth forgave us." Benson frowned, shifting in his saddle. "You got a sharp tongue for a squaw." Nalinah's gaze never wavered. "You speak of ownership. But who among us truly owns what cannot be kept? The wind, the rain? The mercy of another?" The words hung in the air, quiet and heavy. Even the horses seemed to still. Eli looked at her, saw the strength in her stance, the calm defiance that carried more power than any bullet. She was not pleading for a place. She was reminding them that no man's hate could rewrite the law of decency. Benson shifted again, uncomfortable. "We didn't come here for talk." "Then ride," she said simply. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Benson spat into the dirt. "You'll regret this, Harper." "Maybe," Eli said, his voice low and even. "But not today." The men turned their horses and rode off, dust trailing like smoke behind them. When the sound of hooves faded, the ranch fell silent again. Only the wind moved, soft through the grass, like a sigh of the earth itself. Eli set the rifle down and turned toward the porch. Nalinah stood where she had been, the light washing gold across her face. For a moment, neither spoke. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Her eyes met his. "I did. For her." She glanced at Taza, who watched them both with solemn curiosity. "And for you," he hesitated. "You've got courage enough for 10 men," she smiled faintly. "Courage is only fear that learned to walk." That night, after Taza had gone to sleep, they sat by the fire. The silence between them was not heavy, only full. Eli stared into the flames, the light painting gold across his weathered hands. "She'll remember this place," he said. "Maybe one day she'll tell someone it was home for a while." Nalinah's expression softened. "And you? What will you tell?" "That a woman once came to my door, carrying a child and a promise I didn't deserve." Her lips parted as though to reply, but the words never came. She looked at him, truly looked, and something in her gaze held the weight of all that had passed between them. When the fire burned low, she rose and went to the door. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we ride." He nodded, though the word settled like a stone in his chest. Dawn came gentle and gold, spreading across the plains. Dew clung to the grass like tears not yet shed. Nalinah moved quietly, saddling her horse while the world still held its breath. Taza stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders. "Will we come back?" she asked. Nalinah smiled and touched her cheek. "We never truly leave what we love." Eli came out then, the light catching in his hair. "You don't have to go," he said. "You owe me nothing." She met his eyes. "Freedom was never what I sought." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. Peace was. He had no words for that, only a nod, slow and pained. She mounted the horse, gathering the reins. For a moment she looked down at him, sunlight spilling over both their faces. Then she turned, riding slow toward the far hill. Eli stood where she left him, the morning wind tugging at his coat. Taza ran to his side, slipping her small hand into his. Together they watched the rider move against the horizon, a dark figure in the rising gold. At the crest of the hill, Nalinah stopped. She turned in the saddle, her shawl lifting in the breeze. Across the open space between them, her gaze found his. For a heartbeat, the world went still. The land, the light, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eli raised a hand, the smallest of gestures. She returned it, a flicker of motion like a blessing carried by the sun. Then she turned again, riding onward into the morning light. He watched until she disappeared beyond the ridge, leaving only the glint of her path and the cry of a lone hawk circling high above. And when he finally turned back toward the house, the world felt changed, not brighter, not gentler, but more alive. The fire in the hearth had burned low, yet its warmth lingered in the air. He smiled faintly, whispered to the wind, "Ride home safe." The plains carried the words, soft and endless, across the open land that had once divided them, and now, in quiet grace, bound them forever. Tone and realization, bittersweet, redemptive, and deeply human. The scene closes with stillness rather than triumph, the kind of peace earned through struggle, not granted by it. The realization, belonging isn't ownership, nor promise, nor name. It's the moment when two souls recognize each other as home, even if the road leads them apart.